This meeting is being recorded.
Alrighty, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Antoine McDonald. I am a reference librarian here at the Rochester Public Library, Local History and Genealogy Division. And thank you for joining us on this Saturday for our Rochester's Rich History series. I'm going to give a brief introduction to our speaker today, James M. Odato. James M. Odato is an award-winning daily newspaper reporter who has worked in Binghamton, Schenectady, Albany, and Buffalo, New York. With a career rooted in watchdog reporting, Odato has been cited as one of New York's top news hounds, covering state government, gambling, and abuse and waste of public money. So we want to ask everyone to welcome us in joining James. And we ask that everyone please keep their microphones on mute for the remaining of the session. And please refrain from questions. And we're going to hold all questions until the end of James's presentation. And we'll do a question and answer session at the end. If you have any questions, you can hold on to them to ask verbally at the end, or you can feel free to put them in the chat box at any point throughout the presentation. And I will keep track of those and ask those all at the end. And I think that is all for right now. I will pass it over to James. And in the meantime, copy of the book.
Holy smoke. Does the Rochester Library have a hardbound copy of This Brain Had a Mouth? That's a hardbound, huh?
Yeah, this is a hardbound copy, yes.
Wow, you folks sprung for the big time. Thank you very much.
Absolutely, absolutely.
We'll look
And
it up. Go ahead.
We have 2 copies.
Excellent. Thank you. All right. Well, thank you for coming in this morning or this afternoon. We're here to talk about a woman as opposed to me, the author. But I am going to be using the phrase I quite a few times. So please bear with me, because there's a story about the journey to this story that you might find interesting. I wanted to thank the Rochester Public Library and the historian of Rochester in particular, Christine Radarski, who, among many people who are historians, archivists, public educators, keepers of public repositories and private repositories of records, all these people have helped me assemble a great deal of information about Lucy Gwin. And they've also inspired me. I'm writing a book about a woman who I never met before. She was on the planet for 71 years. She died in 2014. And Lucy Gwin lived in Rochester for several years of her life. And so, of course, Rochester plays a part in this book in more than one way. So let me just talk about how I got involved in researching this book. And one of the nice things about my profession, I've been a journalist for my entire adult life. And journalism forces you to learn about things that you might not ordinarily study or learn about. And it forces you, actually gives you the opportunity to meet a lot of people in a lot of different corners of the world and a lot of different situations and predicaments and calamities in many cases. And what journalists are always doing is trying to find a good story. And when they do, they can't help but try to learn more and report it out, so to speak. So what I did was, I've been a professor, an instructor of journalism since 2015. I've worked for a number of daily newspapers, and I suspect, because one of them was the Buffalo News, I suspect that there's a number of people tailgating right now because there's a big Patriots Bills game coming up. And that's why they're not joining us on the Zoom meeting right now. But as a professor of journalism, one of the things I do is I tell my students that you never know what you're going to find if you go looking for a good story. And I tell my students, as a matter of fact, I build into my syllabus a trip to the archives at the University of Albany. And at the University of Albany library, the science library on the third floor, are archives of all kinds of interesting people. And I teach upper class persons, people in the journalism department who are juniors and seniors. And many of them had never stepped into the archive, even thought about stepping into the archive until they've taken my class, which to some degree is not surprising, but it's also a little bit disappointing. So what I do is I introduce them to what is possible if you go looking through the records in those boxes. And one year in 2018, I decided to practice what I preach. And what I did was I went hunting on finding aids online to see what kind of material was at archives within a couple of hours drive from my home in Schenectady. And I found some very excellent possibilities. And I did travel to a number of colleges and universities to their archives. I discontinued my search when I got to the 25th floor of what was North America's tallest library at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, where there are 6 boxes that are the Lucy Gwin papers. They looked promising from afar, but in person, they were more than promising. They had, they contained journals, manuscripts, music lyrics, poetry, personal records, hospital records, legal records, and every copy of Mouth magazine over 18 years that Lucy published. And there are examples of very fine writing by a woman who put sentences together more than effectively. She put sentences together powerfully. And I was sitting there at a wooden table on the 25th floor of the University of Massachusetts archive. And I'm on a hard seat and I'm looking at these documents and I'm thinking someone should write a book about this woman. So what you are seeing here is the work that started in June of 2018 when I found those records. Now, among the things I did before and during the research on this book was I was exposed to the idea of writing a book. And that is one of the wonderful things about being associated with a college or a university is that you are exposed to cool ideas. And I, in the back of my mind, had the cool idea that maybe I could do a narrative nonfiction piece, a long form narrative nonfiction piece that could be a book someday. And I went to some seminars or actually conferences that were, in many cases, they for several years, I think we've been on hold now. It's called Researching New York, at which historians, public historians, and authors and book publishers would gather to talk about books that were being done or had been recently been done about people in New York State. And I listened to these people talk about their work. And I thought, gee, they're just people like me that went out and did some hard work and learned about somebody and came back and wrote about those people. And I'm thinking I could do that. And all I needed was a good subject. Well, guess what? Lucy Gwin, who lived in Rochester for a number of years, was more than a good subject. But I needed to know that she was a reliable subject. She, in her records, talked about what happened to her, how she came about to being a disability rights activist. And it all started in Rochester. It was a very interesting moment in Rochester history. Back in the 80s, when Rochester was a bustling city, economically robust, Xerox, Bosch and Lomb, of course, Eastman Kodak, employing people left and right. Lucy Gwin and a lot of her friends decided to relocate to Rochester from the Midwest, from Illinois and Indiana and places like that, far-flung locations. Why? Because, as I learned, Rochester had a Zen center, one of two such centers in the country that were taught by masters. And it drew Lucy and others to Rochester. Lucy, when she was in Rochester, opened up a restaurant. She was an adventurous and entrepreneurial spirit. She's someone who came from the advertising business. She was working in Chicago, okay? And she talked about how she, at age 30, decided to give up the ad business because she didn't want to lie for a living anymore. So she and some of her friends moved to Rochester, the city on Lake Ontario. And according to her story, and according to her writing, which was documented in a book that she wrote, a memoir that she wrote after her restaurant in Rochester went bust. She went to live in Louisiana and became a deckhand on the big, massive 500-ton boats that served the oil rigs off the coast of Louisiana and the Gulf of Mexico. She's a woman in her 30s in an all male-dominated industry. And she wrote a book about her year out there. It's called Going Overboard. And it was one more example of fine writing, going overboard. And it shows Lucy in the back with rope over her shoulders. It's an excellent memoir, another example of fine writing. And it had little ingredients about her background in it, things that she sprinkled in about her biographical background. Useful. But she went back to Rochester after her 1 year at sea and returned to the advertising business for a little while until she got into an accident. She was living on Brighton Street. Anybody from Rochester probably knows that area. It's nice. It's not too far from the Eastman mansion. And she decided that she wanted to get into the dating game again. She started writing advertisements in a local newspaper that I believe still exists, called City Newspaper. Blind ads, woman looking to meet men. And she was on her way to one of these dates when she got into an accident on Lake Avenue. Anybody from Rochester knows Lake Avenue. It's a northwest highway, busy. And she was going after work on this heavily used traffic arterial that is sort of follows the Genesee River. And she got into an accident. And she became a member of Disability Nation that day. She went to the hospital, and then she went into a rehab facility. And at that rehab facility, she realized that people with traumatic brain injuries, like her, at this facility in Cortland, New York, have lost agency over their own care, over their own lives. They've lost their independence. Now, this is a woman who was fiercely independent, and she didn't like what was going on at all. And she ended up busting out of that facility, according to the story she gave. And so one of the things that I was getting at earlier is that I needed to know if I was dealing with a reliable narrator. Could I trust this woman's words? Right? So what I needed to do was to see if it was true that she busted out of that rehab facility. Was it true that she got into an accident on Lake Avenue in June of 1989? Was it true that she led a consumer push to have the rehab facility, the chain of rehab, traumatic brain injury rehab centers, investigated? Was she that person? Was she this spirit, this forceful person? So what I needed to do was talk to some people. I also needed some records, because records are the backbone of good investigative reporting. You need documents. You can't just rely on people's memories and their words. So what I did was I filed a Freedom of Information Act request to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I wanted to see if there was I wanted to see if there was a file on Lucy Gwin, because she was a rabble rouser. She was a person who poked and prodded the federal government and federal agencies. Maybe, just maybe, they had a file on her. I also requested the FBI record, the file on the rehab chain they ended up investigating. And it takes a little while for these documents to come through. So while I was waiting for these documents to come through, I started looking through and reading every copy of Mouth magazine, the magazine that Lucy founded in July of 1990 was the first edition. And Mouth magazine is filled with very interesting articles by very interesting writers, including herself. And there are bylines throughout the whole document, throughout the whole magazine, and photojournalist credits. And so I started calling some of these people and talking to them about what it was like working at Mouth magazine and taking direction from Lucy Gwin. And what do you think about her? Give me an idea. Build me some scenes. What was she? What did she say? What did she do? What did she smoke? Everything about her. What did the inside of that apartment in Brighton Street look like? Which were the headquarters of Mouth. So eventually I get my Freedom of Information Act requests. I answered, no, there's no record, no file on Lucy Gwin. But I did get about 1.5 inches of printouts on the other investigation about the rehab chain. And it was heavily redacted. Complaints from all over the country, from various states, various centers, satellites of this chain, including the one that Lucy was at. But among those records was something very interesting and very helpful, as a matter of fact, critical. It was a printout of a story done by an advocacy newspaper that looked at the rehab industry and the medical industry. And it was a story about a woman who broke out of a rehab facility in Cortland, New York in the summer of 1989, named Lucy Gwin. And it quoted Lucy Gwin talking about how she got out of that, sprung herself from that facility after 3 weeks. And better yet, it quoted the individual who busted her out, the ex-boyfriend that she called up and said, please come get me. And it was a first and last name. And I found him in Rochester, New York, and he talked to me. And as a matter of fact, his first comment to me was, I said, I called about 130 people up to talk about Lucy Gwin for this book. And they were almost all cold calls. People weren't expecting the call. And everybody had vivid memories of Lucy Gwin, what she said and how they interacted 25, 30 years after their last conversation with her or interaction with her. So this fellow I call up out of the blue, and the first thing he says to me after I tell him what I'm up to is, I don't talk to reporters. I don't do that. And then 60 minutes later, after we were done having a conversation about her, because once he started talking about Lucy, he couldn't stop. He actually sent me a picture of the restaurant Lucy had created called Hoosier Bill's. And he had been a cook there. He had met her there. And, but more importantly, this man who told me everything about the breakout confirmed the story Lucy had been telling people. And so it was one more reason to keep working on it. And so that's what I did. And the more I listened and the more I heard, the more I realized this is a story, a book, and perhaps an important one, because it required me, like I told you before, reporters get to learn about the subjects they're writing about. I didn't know much about the disability rights movement. And I'm afraid that most Americans don't know much about the disability rights movement and all the things that went into creating the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the movement that still exists. And there are many movements that have happened in this country. There have been many historical moments in this country that are lacking from our public education curriculums. But there are many movements we know about, and there are many movements that get coverage in the newspapers. But there's one that I feel is kind of missing. That there's a hole in the American history curriculum and also in mainstream newspapers coverage, and that involves the disability rights movement. That Lucy Gwin saw that hole, so she created something called Mouth Magazine. But when I was done with that conversation with the Rochesterian, who was Lucy's ex-boyfriend, one of many ex-boyfriends I learned, is something I asked at the end of many interviews. And like I said, I probably interviewed 130 people for extensive interviews. And I probably averaged 90 minutes with each one. Some people I spent hours with in multiple interviews. But what I would usually end my first interview with is, do you think Lucy would be a good subject of a book? And invariably, people would say yes. But that first fellow, that very important man who broke her out, drove her back to Rochester, said, are you kidding me? She'd be a good subject for a movie. And one of the things I learned is that there were people considering doing a movie about Lucy Gwin, particularly about the book Going Overboard that she wrote, the memoir about her 1 year as a deckhand, because it's so vivid. The scenes she paints, scenes she painted herself were so vivid and so colorful and so interesting. I can see why that there were some producers and directors out there considering a screenplay. But what I was trying to do in the book is to do something similar. I wanted to write about a fascinating life, in not just tell it, but to show it in scenes, in some scenes that you could actually imagine. And one of the things that I want to make sure I say in this address is that I couldn't have done it. I couldn't have gotten it all together without the wonderful interviews, without the backbone that I got from an archive. The archivist who went from Amherst, Massachusetts to Washington, Pennsylvania, which was the last city that Lucy lived in, where the last city that of Mouth Magazine's existence. A fellow named Rob Cox, he's the archivist at UMass, knew that there was a woman living in who had been living in Rochester, who moved to Topeka, Kansas, and then moved to Washington, Pennsylvania, with this project of hers called Mouth Magazine, and with this incredible passion to work to improve the lives of people with disabilities, that it was worth for him driving 9 hours to Pennsylvania and filling up the back of his Subaru with the boxes that he brought back to UMass and had sorted and cataloged and waiting for me several years after he went and got them, knowing that someday somebody would be researching issues involving disability rights, or perhaps Lucy herself, knowing this. And one of the things that I also want to say is that I got a lot of help, guidance from the University of from the University at Albany English department, from biographers and archivists, who, particularly Ron Bosco, who was an advisor to me. And one of the things he said to me right off the bat was, when I talked to him about this project, is that he encouraged and said was important, and I needed to hear that, was that you better get on the phone as soon as possible and talk to these people who are contemporaries of hers. And he's a man in his 70s. He understands that she was a contemporary of his. And he understands how precious time is. And so that's one of the things I did, was I started calling people as soon as possible. And during the course of this project, people who I talked to in January were no longer around in May. And some of those people include Rob Cox, the archivist. He did not make it to see this book published. But when I did get this book published, that's a whole nother story. But I had some university presses in mind. My idea was to pitch it to UMass first and give them first crack at it. I had a very strong sense that there was a market for this material, for this woman's story. And UMass was interested. And so I didn't have to try it anywhere else. So the University of Massachusetts Press published this book. They published it not because the records are at UMass, because UMass Press and the UMass Library are two different units of a UMass system. But they recognized, as a lot of other people did, was that there was an important story to tell. And it's a story in which the face of the disability rights movement was Lucy Gwin. She was the face. But you know, Lucy Gwin had a long life before she got hit by that car, went to that rehab facility, and decided that she was going to open an advocacy journalism product called Mouth Magazine. She had a long life. She was 46 years old when she got hit by that car. She was born in 1943. A lot happens in 46 years. And so what I wanted to do was try to figure out, how did Lucy Gwin become Lucy Gwin? How did she become this force? Was she always this person before and after the traumatic brain injury? And what you learn when you start trying to discover any subject, but particularly a life, is that there are many ups and there are many downs. There are many clues as to how someone becomes who they are. I am not, like some biographers, someone who tries to peddle in psychiatry and human behavior and explain human behaviors. But what I can do is provide information that allows a reader to draw his or her own conclusions from the information that they're shown. And that's where I think strong biography lies, is where biographers don't tell you and assume and conclude. They just show you and you conclude. You read between the lines. You read around the margins. And I hope that I, in this book, allow you to make your own conclusions. There are many types of biographies and approaches you can take. And one of the things I did was study biography. And I studied the kind of biography I particularly that appealed to me. And this is a journalistic product. It's third person. I don't call Lucy Lucy. I let people call Lucy Lucy. But when I refer to Lucy, I refer to her as Gwen. Gwynne, excuse me. So it's an arm's length relationship between me and the subject. I'm letting the subject, however, tell her own story in many cases with her own words. The words she left behind in print, some of which are on the 25th floor of the UMass Library, some of which exist in the 18 years of Mouth Magazine, but also in the words she left ringing in the ears of the people I talked to. So it's Lucy's story. I simply collected the information and distilled it and delivered it in some kind of form. And the form is called narrative nonfiction. And there are many ways to write narrative nonfiction. You can start, for instance, with a chronology. Lucy Gwin was born in January 1943 in Indianapolis, Indiana. She went to school. She went to high school. She did this, she did that, one step at a time. Now, I didn't think that kind of chronology would work with this book, because I wanted to hook the reader right at the very onset with some action. And so I start the book with the critical car accident that took place on Lake Avenue in Rochester in June of 1989. And so what I needed to do, among other things, is understand Rochester. I traveled to Rochester. I met a wonderful friend of Lucy's there, and we toured around. We saw the homes, the apartments that she lived in. She had 3 in the city. We found the location of her accident. We figured out what she must have experienced on Lake Avenue that day during the rush hour, because it's a busy road. And we saw the little incline that she was going up and the little decline that whoever hit her was coming down. And you could just imagine the wallop. And I saw the hospital records in her file at UMass. And they were all valuable because they declared that she had traumatic brain injury. Now, I want to talk to you about some of the pursuit of this story. And again, I couldn't have done it. We were introduced this morning by Antoine. Antoine is the director of the local history unit of the Rochester Library. I have a warm, a very warm part of my heart for local historians. Some of my finest relatives are local historians, one of my dear sisters-in-law. But local historians gather, preserve, and provide such vital information. And so when I was on my pursuit of information, I contacted the Rochester historian, Christine Radarski, and I said, hey, look, I'm working on a story or on a book or on something at that time involving a woman named Lucy Gwin, who got into a car accident in June of 1989. I think it was June 14th, but I'm not certain. Do you have anything on it? Anything in your records, anything in your microfilm? Because the local history department, among other things, has old records from newspapers, in some cases, that don't exist anymore. And what have you got on Lucy Gwin? And gosh, they delivered. So let me just share the screen. I want to show you some stuff that I think you might find interesting, because I did. Okay, now I put together a PowerPoint. Can everybody see this? Raise your hand if you can see this. Okay, good. Thank you, Fred. Okay, Unearthing a Fascinating Life, researching and writing this brain had a mouth. Now it started, as I told you, I went to the University of Massachusetts, and I'm up there on the 25th floor. You can see in the background, I hope you can see these white boxes, right? This is me listening to, among other things that I found at UMass, not only these white boxes that include, those boxes represent lives. Those are precious boxes. So I'm in one of them, and that's Lucy Gwin's papers. And one of the things I learned when I went up to the UMass library, to the archives, is that there were also oral histories of some of the leaders of the disability rights movement up there. And some of those oral history tapes included interviews with Lucy Gwin. So I got to hear her voice on those earphones. So I was listening to her as I was reading her records. Okay, now what do the records tell you? Okay, this is from the UMass records. I got to see her handwriting. I got to hear her voice. I got to read her telling me what it was like recovering from brain injury, what it was like in the rehab center where they had sent her. And these are very personal, very vivid scrawlings. And you can actually see over time her handwriting getting stronger. Okay, now, what else did I find there at UMass? It was absolutely vital. Okay, look at this. This is a personal ad written by Lucy Gwin. Lucy, as I told you, was filing or paying for advertisements in the city newspaper in Rochester, this alternative weekly. And she was looking for dates. And this is a fine example of the kind of advertising skill she has. She was advertising herself to the market, to the dating market. Personal ad, number one, everything once, nothing twice. Loving woman with a perhaps too fascinating history wants a one-of-a-kind man with a sense of direction and a history of his own to tell. Statistics unimportant if you've got heart, soul, and guts. Object, more fun than anyone has a right to expect. Drop first name and phone to box 5682, city newspaper. Okay. That is a woman telling a biographer, you ought to look into me. You ought to find out about me. Here's a woman who's telling me that she's looking for someone with a sense of direction and history of his own to tell. She's someone who has a fascinating history, she says. And she says, it doesn't matter who you are, just as long as you've got heart, soul, and guts. Okay, so she's telling you right off the bat in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines, couple of dozen words. It's an advertisement to come look, come investigate. That's what I did. Okay, so here's the first, the early editions of Mouth magazine. UMass has got every single copy of Mouth magazine. And you know what? Because of my pursuits, I do too. I have almost every copy. There's a few of the early ones I'm missing. Now, when Lucy broke out of that, or disassociated herself with that rehab center in Cortland, New York, in the summer of 1989, she went back to Rochester, and she was furious. She didn't like the way she was treated. She felt that the rehab facility was simply milking her insurance company for hundreds of dollars a day for care she wasn't getting. They weren't listening to her. They didn't give her a patient's bill of rights to tell her what her rights were. So she started calling state investigatory agencies, federal investigatory agencies, departments of health, elected leaders, writing to them, saying you have to investigate. Now, the wheels of bureaucracy turn rather slowly. So in the interim, while she was still pursuing justice, she decided to take her anger and open up a magazine. Here's a woman who never went to college, never took a journalism class, wasn't on her student newspaper in high school. Starts the magazine. She calls it "This Brain Has a Mouth" to start with. And the first couple of years, that's what it was called, because she was very focused on the brain injury industry, because she was a victim of brain injury. But she learned, just like I did, that the disability rights movement was much bigger than people who had suffered head injuries. And so she ended up changing the name of the magazine to simply Mouth. And it was the voice of people with disabilities, all kinds of people, people with blindness, people with hearing impairments, people with developmental disabilities, everyone. And what she learned was that the biggest minority group in America, millions of people of all kinds, were part of this nation. And she identified as of June of 1989, and for the rest of her life, as someone who suffered from a disability. So the archives were the backbone of this research. Now, other public repositories were absolutely helpful too. I mean, I went to the Monroe County Clerk's Office for records. I found the incorporation papers for Hoosier Bills, the restaurant. I'm trying to remember, it's Monroe Street, that she ran for 5 years. And at that time, she called herself Lucy Douglas, because that's who she was for a while. She was Lucy Gwin in high school. She got married right out of high school. She got married a second time to a fellow named Douglas. And when she got to Rochester, she was still known as Lucy Douglas. And the public repositories, the clerk's offices, the courthouse records, the federal court records, they all help you put the puzzle together, okay, as do these local historians. Okay, so one of the things I learned in this search, and I've been, working in New York State most of my life, with a short stint in DC. So in New York, you can't get a lot of records. You can't get death records. You can't get divorce records. It's tough to get a lot of records. And what I found out in Indianapolis or in Indiana, you can get marriage records from the Indiana State Library. And it's got the name of Lucy Gwin, when she got married, 7/30/1960, what county, Marion, the name of her first husband. Okay, important detail, because for a long time, I was using a record that I got from ancestry.com, and it had the wrong name of the spouse, had the same date, same county, same woman, but the name of the husband was misspelled. It's close, but misspelled. And I suspect that a lot of ancestry records are a little spotty. So if you can go to the source, the actual public record, as opposed to these intermediary records, it's very important. And once I got the real name, it opened up a lot of other clues, including avenues to reaching some of the people who knew her when. Okay, so next on my list, Ancestry was very helpful because it had the yearbook records from where Lucy went to school. Okay, now you see this young woman with the stare looking off to the left. Looks like she has a destiny in mind, doesn't it? So this woman, Lucy Gwin, lines up on a page with a lot of other people who have fat lines of material on what they did while they were in school. Lucy's got two things. In her first year at this big high school in Indianapolis, with lots of opportunities, lots of clubs, lots of everything, lots of kids. Lucy Gwin, first year she tried the Latin club out. Okay, what does that tell you? It tells you that she's interested in words and the roots of words. Okay, in year two, she tried out another club, the cheer block. She tried out being a cheerleader, rooting for something. And then she dropped off the map. Now, why are these records great? Well, it's nice to see what she looked like in 1959, 1960, somewhere around there, whenever they snapped that shot. It's also nice to look at those names. Look at all those people you can call up and say, hey, what was Lucy like in 1959? Who did she hang around with? What were her interests? Okay, lots of opportunities. You know, one of the things I found out, people didn't remember Lucy. The president of the Alumni Association for the class of 1960 didn't remember her. Put out feelers to all the people in his network. Nobody seems to remember her very well. Well, what Ancestry.com and what the Indiana State Record tells me is that just a few months after graduation, Lucy Gwin was married. And a little after her 18th birthday, she became a mother. So what it tells me is that Lucy was pregnant at the time that she graduated from high school. And that fills in some of the story. How did Lucy Gwin become Lucy Gwin? Okay, now there's many interesting pieces of information that get me from the early 1960s to the late 1960s. The decade of the 60s were very important in the book, very important in the history of the United States. Think about the 60s. Think about Lucy Gwin. Lucy Gwin was a World War II child. She was born in 1943 in Indianapolis. What kind of city is Indianapolis? What kind of influences do you have in Indianapolis? Okay. Who were her parents? Newspapers.com helped me a lot to find out a lot of information about her parents. Interesting things that maybe a lot of people in her family didn't know. Now, Lucy, as I said, was born in 43. She was born just a couple of weeks before Janis Joplin. She was born around the time of Jim Morrison and Jimi Hendrix, people who didn't make it out of the 60s or didn't make it past the age of 27. That is something that could have happened to Lucy, because Lucy was a product of the 60s as well. And the 60s were tough. The 60s were turbulent. A lot of people died in the 60s. They went to Vietnam, didn't come home. Movement figures died. MLK, Malcolm X, Bobby Kennedy didn't make it. And of course, Lucy was living in Chicago in the 60s, working for a huge ad firm, proving that she could make a lot of money if she wanted to, writing ad copy about bran flakes and toothpaste. And right down the street from, or in the same city that she lived in later on in 1968, I believe it was, right? Was when the Chicago Democratic Conference and Convention took place, and we heard about people like Abby Hoffman. But why do we know the names of Abby Hoffman? Why do we know the names of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and all the other movement leaders, various movements? We can rattle off names of gay rights movement leaders and Black Panthers and all kinds of people. But name me a couple of leaders of the disability rights movement. See, this is something I had to learn. I had to learn about who these people were, because Lucy started interacting with all these people. She went on a crash course to learn all she could. And she will tell you she was dumb as a box of rocks about the disability rights movement when she became a member of Disability Nation. Okay, records. Okay, one of the things I learned is that you can't get divorce records easily in a lot of states. You can't get them at all in New York State, unless they end up in some litigation. But the divorce records are available in Illinois. And I found Lucy's divorce records in Illinois. And it told me some things about her that held up her end of the story in terms of her loss of and it explains some of the estrangement she had with her two children. She ended up having two daughters. Okay. Early records. Lucy loved animals, loved dogs in particular, all her life. This is young Lucy in the Indianapolis Star. She was in a dog competition. She and her dog. This is her dog she loved. One of many dogs she had in her life. She was a lifelong animal lover. Let me put it that way. Fervent. And she would not do anything to harm an animal. So, and that was important to know because in the accident she was in 1989, she was traveling with her dog Digger. And Digger was her company that day. Okay. Records. Louisville Courier. It's got information about Lucy's parents. Lucy's mother grew up in Louisville. Her father was right over the river in Indiana. And this is a record. I was trying to build everything I could to learn about Lucy's parents. And one of the things I learned is that Lucy was the second daughter of three daughters that her parents had together. The first daughter died. And so Lucy was number two. Okay. Another record you found in the search of the Gwynne family was a record of Lucy's younger sister who had a tough time in the 1960s. Okay, that's her on the pavement. Okay, now private records, critical. There were private repositories. As I started getting into this story, I found people who had access to lots of records involving Lucy Gwin, one of whom was the executor of her estate, who opened up a warehouse with all kinds of records that Rob Cox did not bring back to UMass for some reason. And there were other manuscripts, other journals, other key documents. And this is Lucy's merchant marine license when she went to work on the coast of Louisiana. And it's great because it shows me what she looks like. Look at that stare. Doesn't she look like a different woman from the one you saw in that yearbook photo? How she changed. And on the back of it, it has her dimensions. It has her height, her weight, color of her eyes, the color of her hair, etc. Details. Every detail is important. Okay, private collections. I got this document. This is the earliest picture of Lucy I was able to obtain. And this is her growing up in Indianapolis with three key people in her early life who certainly played roles in her story. That's Lucy with a toy. You can see her, she's got this toy on a string that she's playing with. And again, she's looking off to the left like she does in her yearbook photo. Now, who's the dominant person in that photo? Who's the person who's sturdy and has a robust personality? Okay, who's the delicate one? Right? Okay, so this is a picture of Lucy snapped by her mom, and it shows her two daughters, her two surviving daughters at that time, and her best friend's son, who's holding the same toy that Lucy's got, but his is slack. And that boy became the subject of one of Lucy's strong essays. And it was published in Mouth. I believe it was published in Mouth. It was published. As a matter of fact, it was published in another magazine. and it's a very strong work. Okay, so this this discussion is about the value of going on a search, right? And what you might be able to find if you go looking. What I tell my students is you just don't know. You never know what you're going to find if you go looking for a story. But once you start looking at a story, once you start probing a story, you know where it's going to go. And it often opens up many other doors, unexpected. And this pursuit opened up many doors to discovery on the part of me, of what the disability rights movement was about. And also helped me discover a number of very kind people, very important people in the life of Lucy Gwin. Interesting people who have their own stories that could be books, should be books, should be memoirs. And Lucy's story is, one of the things that an editor of a publishing house like UMass Publishing House, or an editor of a magazine or an editor of a newspaper will ask the writer, okay, what's the point? Okay, you got all this information, so what's the point of the story? I'm going to leave the reader to decide what the point of the story is. I'm not going to tell them. I told my editor what I thought the publisher what I thought the point of the story was. But I think you can decide for yourself what the point of this story is. But one of the things that Lucy did was she did leave a legacy of strong words that you can read and learn from. And she also left a legacy of people who she touched, good and bad, inspired, in many cases, people who are still in the disability rights movement. And, just historically speaking, the disability rights movement has been out there for years, had been out there for decades before Lucy joined it. But interestingly, the first edition of Mouth magazine came out in July of 1990. In July of 1990, President George H.W. Bush signed into law the Americans with Disabilities Act. And it's the Civil Rights Act for people with disabilities. It's a very important piece of legislation. And just because a piece of legislation is signed into law, and just because a law is on the books, doesn't mean that people are not going to break it. So who's the watchdog on the beat to make sure that the ADA is honored? Maybe a disability rights magazine, maybe an advocacy journalist, maybe a pain in the butt who pokes and prods and lived in Rochester, New York. Okay, now this is more for my students than for you, but the last picture on the slide is me in front of a piece of very interesting and instructional message. It's from Albert Einstein, and it says, if we knew what it was we were doing, it would not be called research, would it? So the value of research, the value of going out and seeing what's out there in records that were put together by someone smart for a purpose, knowing that someday someone was going to look at who was the founder behind Mouth magazine. Okay. All right. So Mr. Antoine, are you there? I see there might be at least one question. Yeah. So let's open up the field to questions because it's cold. People want to start tailgating that Patriots-Bills game. Any questions from our listeners?
Yes, I'm here, Jim. That was me in the chat box. I was just giving you a time check.
Sure, that's
My
fine.
end, I don't see any questions at this time on my end. No questions have been submitted via the chat box.
Okay. All right, so Antoine, you are a man who gets asked questions all the time, being in that local history office. You must have a question.
Yes, I do. And so this is a question that I was thinking of while you were talking. And I was actually looking at the distinction between those two pictures. And you said that she had a pregnancy early. Did she talk about any of her own experiences? And where does she think about herself in all of this? How does she view herself in
Oh,
all of this? And how did her work impact her view on herself?
yeah, I think that Lucy Gwin is a complicated person who had a lot of internal conflict. And I think there are a lot of people who are, as a matter of fact, are probably excellent subjects for biography, who have internal conflicts, who are complicated. And I think that disability activism helped her understand herself a little bit better. She was always exploring oddities, deformities, imperfections, flaws. She studied something for many years. She was studying people. She was concerned about eugenics. She was concerned about the whittling the herd for the perfect human beings. And she was aware of her own imperfections. She even talked about them. So I think that to answer your question, where did she see herself? She saw herself in many reflections. One of the things she said to a friend of hers in Rochester, when she was just starting out as a disability rights activist and publisher of a advocacy journalism product, was that she was okay if someone else was going to be the Martin Luther King of the disability rights movement. She wanted to be the Malcolm X of the disability rights movement. And I see on the wall behind you, you have a picture of Malcolm X. And Malcolm X spoke in Rochester, New York in the 60s. Rochester had a robust and vibrant background in movement issues. I mean, Susan B. Anthony lived in Rochester. Frederick Douglass published the North Star in Rochester. There's something about the vibe in Rochester. I think that Lucy saw herself as someone who can contribute based on her skills and her intellect. She knew how to package and advance a message. And I think she found in disability rights a mission, something she had been looking for most of her adult life. Why am I on the planet? What am I here for? And it was because of that accident. I think she found her role. And so I think that disability rights was a vehicle of discovery for her. I hope that answers your question. Now, Maureen asked this question. Do you think that researchers in the future will have a more difficult time accessing written accounts in the digital age? I think about that all the time. That's a brilliant question, because you, I don't know, Maureen, you and I haven't met. I don't know your background, but I'm very much a paper person. I love paper. I love getting stuff in my hands and looking it over and carrying it into other rooms. So if you go to archives, what you will find are boxes of paper, but more and more you're finding boxes of CDs and digital records. And what is the way most people are storing material now is in Word, right? Microsoft Word. You type out your manuscript, and you email your record, or you text someone. Now, a lot of that stuff gets lost. I mean, early drafts of a manuscript just get written over in Microsoft. So you don't get to see a lot of the early drafts. How did they move from this wonderful first draft to the masterpiece? And all the drafts in between sometimes get lost, and it really is, it's a problem. How do you recreate text strings that go over years? That's one of the things that are wonderful in the Lucy Gwin records. These she kept printouts, or she kept copies of letters she wrote to prospective employers. They're very witty cover letters that she wrote to people she was trying to get to hire her. But yeah, how do you maintain all that stuff? I think the archivists of the future are going to be people who are putting together flash drives, and instead of a whole box of paper, there's going to be little boxes of flash drives and things like that, because it's a digital age, and we are losing, we're losing newspapers even. I mean, newspapers are online mostly now, or a lot of them. So it's a different age, but that's a very good question, Maureen. Okay, so, well, I see that my agent, Antoine, is putting up information on where you can get the book. The book is available from the UMass Press, and all you have to do is type up in your, here we go again, right, with Google or whatever. Use the internet, write UMass Press, and This Brain Has a Mouth, and it'll lead you to opportunities to purchase the book. Fred, you got any questions or comments? You got to put your speaker on. Is he allowed to? Can you allow Fred to speak?
Oh, okay, let's try it.
There you go, Fred.
I'm sorry. No, I don't have any questions. I was just listening, enjoying.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I wanted to bring to your attention also is, I come from mainstream media. I mean, I'm spent my entire life in mainstream media, and I was looking at some records recently about how been thinking about how mainstream media covered the disability rights movement. One of the things that Lucy was very concerned about was that mainstream media wasn't covering the disability rights movement. So I personally am responsible for that myself to some degree. In 2002, the Rochester ADAPT organization. ADAPT is a nationwide group of disability rights activists who often go to Washington, D.C. to march, protest, complain, try to get attention around the issues of improving the lives of people with disabilities. Well, the Rochester Adapt chapter came to Albany when I was working for the Albany Times Union in the Capitol, and they circled the entrance to the Department of Health, which is very close to where I was working. I didn't even have to leave the building because it's all underground and linked. And I went over there and I saw them, people in wheelchairs, a few hundred of them. The Albany Times Union ended up running a story that I contributed to, but I was not the lead reporter on. But they spent all day trying to get the attention of the Department of Health and try to get a meeting with the health commissioner. And, what they were trying to do is to see if Governor Pataki would use a little bit more money to help people continue living independently. And the state of New York gets billions of dollars of Medicaid money, billions. And Governor Pataki was one of the reasons as to why that happened, is because he maximized the amount of the number of programs and things that they could attract federal money for Medicaid purposes. And the ADAPT people simply wanted more money, millions more, but a trifle in a multi-billion dollar budget, used to help people be able to stay home in their own choice of a residence as opposed to an institution to get care. And these people were camping out and disrupting, and the state police were called. And then they moved away. They went to the war room, which is right outside the governor's office. And then they also moved to a location in the concourse. And they were there all day, all night. Some of them got carted away by police. And this is the kind of thing they had to do to get attention. Once or twice a year, they would get attention by making a ruckus somewhere. But the issue, because it's the only way they could get on in the newspaper. And again, Lucy understood that. She was very good at organizing. She organized a protest at the United States Supreme Court in the winter of 1997, as a matter of fact. It's detailed in the book, but it was a key moment in her activism. But Rochesterians were part of the disability rights story. And you of course, you moved to Rochester for that, at least in part for that Zen Center, right?
I did.
Right. Yeah. And that Zen Center is still there. It's still active. It's
Vibrant.
It's been there a long time. So there are many legacies that date back to that time and to those people that were part of Lucy's quote unquote tribe. All right. Well, any other questions from our listeners? Let's see what we have here. Now, I guess I need to mention one other thing. The biography of Lucy Gwin took 3 years to come to press, and it is a story about a woman, and I wanted to indicate that there are many subjects you can spend time on. The choice that, biographers only have so much time, so many books in them. I do not believe for a moment that it was time poorly spent. I learned so much in the process, and I would recommend to writers to not give up projects that whether it's a biography, a memoir, a story about a policy or about a thing, because writers can get discouraged easily. And one of the things that encouraged me the whole time were people like Fred in front of you right now. Fred knew Lucy quite well, and he could have, and many of the subjects I talked to, who I called up cold, who never knew me before, could have been less generous with their time. But one of the things I found was that generosity, I don't know if it was simply the people that Lucy touched were of that ilk, or whether I just got lucky. But the generosity of time and resources that people helped me with on this project, I'll never forget. So Fred, I want to thank you personally, and I want to thank all the people that were associated with this project, including Christine Radarski and the people at the Rochester Public Library. So with that, I think we can start tailgating. Don't you think so, Antoine?
I agree.
Okay.
I agree.
All right. Well, look, at happy Martin Luther King weekend. Thank you very much for the time to discuss this work.
Good to see you.
All right.
Thank you.
You're
Thank
well.
you everyone for coming. Thank you, Jim. Thank
All
you,
right.
everybody, for coming
Thank
today.
you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Antoine.
You're welcome.